Welcome to the Engineer's Dilemma, Balancing Project Goals with Professional Responsibility, a webinar organized by Energy Media and the Energy Circle. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and I'll be your moderator. Today, we'll be discussing the question, should Canadian engineering associations enforce their code of conduct to prevent building infrastructure that contributes to climate change and the degradation of the ecosystem? I have no doubt that that will be a very hotly debated topic. I'd like to introduce our panelists now, and I'll start with geoscientist Jenny Yeremiy. And Jenny, if you could just give us a minute, just a little background on your work in the oil and gas industry and in Alberta.
Yeah, you bet. So the first 12 years of my career was almost strictly in development. So I started as a technical geophysicist, creating images of the subsurface. And then after 5 years, went into interpretation and the development of some key fields, one of which I drilled the first horizontal well in the Horn River Basin. So the first shale well, horizontal shale well drilled in Canada. So that was my exposure. And then in 2012, I went to a startup company and worked for somebody who allowed me to see the whole business. And I looked at the reserve reports and started really focusing on liability. Liability became a real interest of mine. I was concerned about what we were creating at the companies I was at and how these problems were growing over time. And so when prices came out, that became my 100% focus, and landed me in a role in CNRL in the last couple of years of my career, where I was looking at liability policy and regulations. So I'm very familiar with this area and really see that as a big part of when we talk about climate risk mitigation, a big piece that we're not really speaking about most of the time.
Jenny, can you very briefly describe your interest in the water issue?
Yeah, so in particular, understanding the amount of water that is associated with oil and gas operations is something that was beyond my knowledge at the time. I looked very closely at like the mine financial security program without appreciating the amount of continuous use of fresh water in that work, 200 billion liters a year to a tune of over 1.7 trillion liters today.
Okay, now we're going to talk to engineer Scott Janzen. Scott, if you can give us a little bit about your background, please.
Yes, worked in the utility industry for over 24 years. Started off in Saskatchewan, so I've worked in Saskatchewan, worked in Alberta, worked in British Columbia, most recently with BC Hydro for 17 years. Doing a lot of work. Really, I mean, at the beginning, putting wires on sticks, and then now working with clients trying to connect to the grid. And what I have seen over that time is it has got increasingly difficult for new companies to connect to the grid. And now what I'm doing is I'm consulting for a bunch of different clients, including First Nations, to find ways to connect to the grid and implement distributed energy resources.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Engineer Zac Trolley, based in Alberta. Zac, give us a little bit of your background, please.
Yeah, I'm an electrical engineer. Been working in Alberta for about the last 15 years, the last 10 of that in project engineering. And I have a degree in professional ethics as well, which is why this is very interesting to me. Most of my work is actually on the later phase in design and construction and commissioning, so very near the end of the project phase. So we've been focused on safety and design, but similar to Jenny, looking at the industry holistically and how do we plan from the very, very beginning to the end, and what role engineers have in that space.
Great, thanks, Zac. Okay, before we get into the specific questions, and each one of the panelists has contributed a number of issues that they would like to talk about today. We won't get to all of them, but I picked at least a couple from each one of their submissions. But before we get into that, we want to talk about the code of conduct for APEGA. And Scott, we apologize because, of course, you're in the BC Engineers Association, but I assume it's probably very similar. And there are 5 points that I think that bear on this conversation. And the first one, and I think maybe is the most important or the most relevant to this conversation, is professional engineers and geoscientists shall, in their areas of practice, hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public and have regard for the environment. And the argument has been made that, in fact, engineering, for example, oil and gas assets that will then become stranded assets in the not too distant future, is not having a regard for the environment. And what role then? What's the responsibility of the engineer who's working on it, on those projects, and will be putting their stamp on things? So, Scott, what I'd like to do is ask you just what's your general take on the engineer's responsibility in this area?
Sure. And I think EGBC might have been one of the first organizations to implement this. There's a bunch of training on it. I know even as of 10 years ago, it's been very strict on riparian zones, on construction around riparian zones, and people have been arrested and almost gone to jail, engineers who did not respect the riparian zone and the fish habitat. So, I mean, that is probably very similar across all jurisdictions. The key thing now that we're seeing is large projects that are moving forward that may be stranded and use scarce resources. And in my viewpoint on it is, there makes no sense for a large LNG project to be electrified. I mean, economically, it doesn't make sense. And it'd be better to just use the natural gas to do the compression. But some of these projects move forward based on that, and then it's switched at the last moment, and it leaves the public purse, the taxpayers, funding that cost of that transmission.
We'll talk about BC LNG projects and just later on in the webinar. But let's hear from Zac now. Zac, what's your general take on engineers having a regard for the environment?
Well, I think in their day-to-day, most engineers I work with do so very honestly, and they feel it's very important for them to do so. But like I said, I'm in the end of the process. So by the time we get to detailed engineering, the project boundaries have already been specified. Who's building what and what's going where has kind of already been decided. We're just doing the details. So, picking safety equipment, making sure it's safe to operate, making sure it's safe to for the public to be around within the bounds of the project scope or project charter. But to your question, when we get to that point, we're not involved in what the project actually is. Is it a coal power plant? Is it a geothermal power plant? Is it going to be stranded? Are we designing something for a 50-year lifespan that's going to be obsolete in 10 years? Those aren't questions that arise. So, when we're looking at the ethics of engineering in safety and design, I think Alberta's world class. I think we do this amazingly. We see what happens in the Fort McMurray fires. We evacuated 80,000 people in a day with almost no casualties. You can't do that anywhere else in the world because we have such a safety-oriented culture. I just don't think we're taking it that next step in the project selection to say, is this project, not the engineering inside of it, but is the project itself in the public's best interest?
Jenny, the next question's for you, and I want to put a little bit of a wrinkle on this because I know you're involved heavily in the water issue, and that raises the question of what kind of consideration should go into the design of these projects, sort of upstream of what Zac was talking about. By the time he gets the project, it's already designed, decisions have been made, and he doesn't have input into those. So what's the responsibility of the engineers upstream who do have the responsibility for that? And Is there a problem? Like, I know a lot of engineers in Alberta. Believe me, over the last 10, 15 years, I've engaged with many of them, had many conversations. None of them are bad people. Nobody's out to, destroy the planet just so they can put a few extra shekels in their pocket. So is it a culture issue that we're having to deal with here? Is it a policy issue? Is it a recognition that change is coming, but we haven't, in Alberta, we haven't got it yet? What's your take?
Yeah, such a great question, and it really tees off from what these guys were just saying. So when I left the industry in 2022, I've been trying to answer that question myself, Markham. I think it's the decisions aren't being made by us; they're being made by executives, and that goes across the board. Zac and I had a conversation before this discussion around how we step in and decisions are already made on the projects that we're entering into. For example, I'll be specific. Carbon capture and storage was not decided in a development department. It was decided in the corporate governance department. So that means there wasn't a sign off from engineering on those decisions, that decision to carry forward on those projects. And we say the same from a environmental stewardship. Land stewardship laws are not being upheld to a scientific level. We have laws that were passed under the UCP that promote well site closure on timelines in line with what's required for land stewardship. The stuff that Scott was talking about, riparian zones being upheld, that's one component of it. But we need to, for example, in Cold Lake, where the carbon capture hub is being planned, is 96% disturbed. And that's an area that needs to be reduced by 2060. That's the ask. I believe it's down to less than 40%. I can't remember the number exactly. But the point is these are areas where we're working in the opposite direction of where we need to be. And there's no say by a professional to say, no, we can't participate in this reason, not in the industry. And I can tell you now, not outside of the industry. Organizations like the watershed councils report to the government, which is being decided by industry. So we're all under this umbrella of corporate decision making.
Well, I want to ask the first question of you. So since you're all warmed up now, we'll give you the first question. It's about stranded capital, stranded assets. And you do a lot of work in environmental liability. So what we're talking about here is conventional oil and gas wells that have been decommissioned. They're maybe in the inactive list. There's like 80,000 of them in the inactive list. There are wells that have been capped, but they haven't been reclaimed yet. There's the environmental liability bill in Alberta is very, very large. It's 30 billion to, depending on who you talk to, $130 billion. Engineers were involved in those decisions at some point. Engineers decide which wells get reclaimed. Is it a gas well, a dry well that doesn't take much money, or is it an oil well, which would cost a lot more to reclaim because there's probably contamination of the soil? In that example I gave you, what is or should be the engineer's responsibility?
Well, in my view, we have a delegated authority. So, and let's include geoscientists in this. Markham's using engineers all holistically here. So I went to the APEGA AGM in April and had passed a motion, whereas to maintain our delegated authority, we have to be reporting and adhering to international standards of climate risk mitigation. So that passed, and so that's being worked through to actually follow, as Scott said, BC's lead in this area. But to me, the responsibility should be first and foremost being able to say, no, this isn't a project that I can participate in. For example, carbon capture and storage. I worked 3 fields that have done gas flooding in the past. Zama, Weyburn, which is well known for its CO2 flooding, and Princess, we did a gas flood in 2016, that we saw breakthrough in months. In each 3 of those cases, we've seen gas breakthrough. This is not something that should be anybody who's worked these assets should have the lived experience that these gases will not stay contained. And even water. I've heard of reports in Cold Lake where there's water at surface there as well.
Now, Scott, you've raised the issue of non-technical folks, people who are not bound by a code of conduct, such as a PEGAS or the BC organization, scoping the project, making all these decisions, yet they have no professional, they don't have to answer to, they're not responsive to a professional organization like yours. How how does that conflict get resolved for engineers, or does it?
So in my experience, it's mostly in utilities, but I think I echo probably a little bit of what Zac and Jenny are highlighting here is that you can have in an organization someone who is maybe politically connected or an accountant, they're a professional accountant, and they're making decisions based on the accounting to say, this is what we can afford and this is what we can't afford. And numerous times there's engineers that go and oppose this and say, if you can't afford it, it's not safe. We cannot move forward with this because it's not safe. And they get overruled by accountants and I'm sorry to blame accountants on this one, but who do not have the technical ability to understand the risk that they're taking. And they do not have the professional reliance, and they're not part of an association that says, so the engineer, and I think Zac put it well, is that you're given the options here that have been dwindled down by non-technical people, and then you're choosing from the worst options. Where if you stepped way back, you said, actually, we didn't even have to do this project at all. We could have done something else, and it would have been better for everybody.
So the what my takeaway from that as a non-engineer, non professional, is that you are the scope of the APEGA code of conduct is fairly broad, but your duties within a particular project, as assigned by a client or by your employer, can be very narrow. And it must be really hard then to resolve those obligations with the narrow role that you have where you don't have any decision-making powers.
Absolutely. The scope of the ethics is all encompassing. Like we have a duty to protect the public, and that sometimes comes into a conflict with the duty to your employer. And I think that sums it up very well.
Now, my next question is to Zac, and you've expressed some concern about stranded assets where there's changes coming, and uh, let's be generous and say that maybe your client, maybe your employer, is not as plugged into the debate around the energy transition and when peak oil demand and all of that stuff is going to happen. And they say, we're going to build a 50-year asset here to process gas or it's another, oil sands, SAGD project, that sort of thing. And you as an engineer say, I don't think it's going to last that long. It's going long before that 50 years is up, it's going to be a stranded asset. How do you deal with that conflict?
It's really tough, and like Scott said, ethics is all encompassing. But we can't have every single person along the chain going back to square one, right? At some point, the work needs to get done and the project needs to happen. And if everyone was second guessing the decisions by the person ahead of you, nothing happens, right? So at a certain point, when you get a document, when you get a report that says X, Y, Z, and it's stamped by a professional engineer, you take their word for it, right? In our profession, we have the respect that when it's signed off by somebody, they did their due diligence, and you trust that due diligence. Where sometimes that becomes an issue is if it's not stamped or you don't believe the intent of the company. I mean, you can just open up the news and see oil and gas companies going bankrupt for whatever reason, and the assets are now either in limbo, in held by public liability, and that kind of goes right against our code of ethics. That in our plan and our scope, it wasn't expressly said, if the client runs out of money, how do we turn this off safely? How do we sequester it safely? How do we ensure that that goes down? Because that's not in the operational manual, right? It's never like wrenches down, walk away tomorrow. That's not a scenario we usually deal with. So it's it runs that conflict. I don't think I have a good answer for that because, like Scott said, we're now running our code of ethics against our company policies to say make the client happy.
Jenny, this question's for you. I've done a fair amount of reporting on the Alberta oil and gas liability side on both conventional oil and gas as well as the oil sands. And one of the things that's very clear is that the regulator and the Alberta government really believe that there will always be a solvent, profitable oil company that possesses the assets that become their liabilities that are need to be reclaimed. They're in the inactive list wherever. And what happens when you're put in a position, and maybe this happened in your career, where that's not going to happen. And that these assets are going to just be put on a list and they're going to sit in some farmer's field and they'll be in limbo and nobody's going to reclaim them. Nobody's going to deal with them in a timely fashion because there is no timeline under Alberta legislation for any oil and gas asset to be reclaimed, at least not on the conventional side. So how do you deal with that? Does this come up in conversation, where geoscientists are talking about these problems?
Well, a couple things. I have to say that there is legislation where sites are on timelines. We have to remember that in land stewardship law, in both Cold Lake and Bestial Lake, there are sites on timelines. 80% of PG&E, so that's on the conventional side, are supposed to be off the landscape in the next 20 years. So I need to clarify that because Mark Doran makes that statement often too. And there's also remediation timelines. So even though that's not reclamation, there are certainly remediation timelines, and the government has done a good job of at least documenting all of those. Any spill that was dropped on any site is now in the public record, and it's on timelines. Whether those timelines are aggressive enough, I doubt. But to your point, Markham, no, I think as Scott was saying, the industry is set up so compartmentalized that my peers didn't think about liability. Only when we were asked on the corner of our desk to look at some abandonment zones to be abandoned. So you have to perf a zone and you have to identify where there's going to be gas leaks. Again, we know we have leakages in wellbores, which is why there's a concern around carbon capture and storage. And that work is always a secondary activity. So I actually presented a concept of life cycle management to my peers at the GEO convention in 2022 and talked about just this, where we need to start looking at this holistically, as these guys have both said, and to me, once we know that carbon capture and storage doesn't work, then we should not be developing. That's an easy thing for all of us to be able to say, I withhold consent from participating in this as new development. It is not a part of the energy transition. What is going to keep the public safe? So to me, that should be something that as professionals, we should be able to say, right? I'm not participating in this. Sorry.
Yeah, you brought up this issue of right to refuse work in the past. And that seems to be, first of all, do engineers and geoscientists have that right in Alberta?
In a sense we do, because we have an obligation. Again, our authority is delegated. We are meant to be operating in the safety of the public. And Scott, you can tell a story. An engineer can shut down a project, correct?
Correct. The point is, yes, any engineer can refuse any work that they deem unsafe. Now, there are no protections in that. If you do that, you are at risk of losing your job. And if you are financially independent, then I think you can do that more often than people who are not. So I think that's the big risk that we have. And again, I go back to the non-technical staff and everything. And it'd be interesting to find out and poll the people who are on here, is that how many engineers have a manager who is not an engineer? And it used to be that the requirement was an engineer had to be managed by an engineer. But a lot of industries have actually went away from that. So you have non-technical people managing engineers and making decisions and overriding their technical decisions, which is incorrect and unethical in my mind, that you can't be doing that. And then the case in point is I was an intervener with the BCUC on the Integrated Resource Plan. In many of the sessions there, I was the only electrical engineer in the building, including all of the utility commission staff, including all of the other interveners, and including everybody sent by the utility by BC Hydro. There were no electrical engineers talking about the resource, the future of electricity in our province. And I look at that and I think that is something that a professional organization, EGBC or APEGA, should say. You need to have technical people in here making decisions and questioning those decisions, or else what are we talking about? We're talking about a lot of legal wording. That's fine. But if it has no basis, technical basis, it's pointless.
So essentially, you would be put in a position of non-technical people, employees, make all of the design decisions and scoping decisions and so on, and then you have a very narrow role of just get it built. So that's where we're at now. From your point of view, Zac, what's your take on the right to refuse work, and how is that important or not important from your point of view?
So I've done work on site and in the shop, wearing coveralls and installing junction boxes, and that was very important, in field work. If there's a situation that's unsafe, if people are unsafe, you stop work immediately and you fix the situation, right? You find workarounds, you figure out how to do it safely, you add in personal protective equipment, whatever it is to make the people safe. Now, in the engineering world, we draw boundaries around the areas that are our expertise, right? So if we're doing a compression station, out in the middle of the field somewhere, we draw that boundary around the compression station. As soon as, a car leaves that fence, that's kind of out of our jurisdiction. We're not worried about that, which is fine. Work needs to complete, but holistically, right? That person leaving there, they have a family, they go skiing in the wintertime, they do all these things. And how does that asset affect, their life during that whole lifespan? I think we need to start asking ourselves, especially in the energy transition, when we're changing what that looks like, changing what the future looks like Scott said, without engineers in that discussion that have the autonomy and the ability to make decisions and have binding decisions, we're using the wrong metrics. And, by the time it comes down to somebody to refuse work, the machine's already well underway and they're just going to find someone else to do it.
Scott, I want to direct this question to you and it's one that I run across in my work as a journalist all the time. And that is, I spend a lot of time interviewing global experts, but also reading global energy modeling of the global energy system, where it's going out to 2030 or out to 2050. And then I come back and I have these conversations in Alberta, and I have a good grasp of the evidence at the global level, the data, and the theoretical and analytical framework within which to discuss that. Then I come back and talk to engineers in Alberta and even in BC, and they really believe that the energy future will look like the energy past, that it's not a transition, nothing is going to change. And we're just going to, all of the new sources of energy like wind and solar are simply going to be absorbed into the growing primary energy demand, which is what happened after 1945. So my question is, and we'll get to the other two panelists as well, is to what extent do engineers and geoscientists have an obligation when they're working in this field to keep up with literature, with evidence, with data on on change, I guess. Let's put it that way.
That's a really good question. Every organization requires the engineers to be up to date in their field, but it is self-directed education. So you may be very narrow, and actually this is an interesting point, is in the past as an engineer to be successful, you specialized and specialized and specialized until you had a very narrow focus and you have very deep knowledge of, say, breakers. So now I know circuit breakers to depth, but I do not care about the larger, I just know how to do circuit breakers. In that case, you could say, I know everything there is to know about circuit breakers, and it doesn't matter what the energy transition is going to happen.
Okay, now that leads me, there's a follow-on question here, and I'm going to ask the same of Jenny. So Jenny, you can prepare as I ask Scott this question. But what's happening, and I say this from personal experience over and over and over again, is that, and engineers are the most conspicuous offenders here, is they say, I am an oil and gas engineer, or I am an electrical engineer working on the power grid or in the power sector, and therefore that makes me an energy transition expert. And that is not the case. I push back on that claim to expertise all the time because, as you say, they're an expert in breakers. That doesn't make them an expert in technological disruption at the global level and where China's going and all of those big picture questions. And is there a sense within the industry that maybe that needs to change, or is that what's your take on that?
So what I can talk about is what happened in BC Hydro, and around 2008 to 2010, there was a big push for the energy transition. I was working in the Power Smart. BC Hydro Power Smart was a big brand. We're about energy efficiency. And then a government changed and it kind of just fell out of favor. So there was a lot of education about how do we be energy efficient, energy transition, light bulbs, LEDs, all of those things. And then it fell out of favor. I mean, the technology didn't change, but the politics changed. So I don't know if that answers it, but I mean, it's that I think there needs to be a broader awareness with engineers, but with the general public, to say, what are we aiming towards? And then how do we get there is different in different areas. The answer is different. But what are we aiming towards is needs to be universal.
Jenny, I want to ask you this question because I won't mention names to protect the guilty, but in the not too distant past, I've had a little bit of a squabble with a geoscientist who wrote an energy transition course and claimed to be an expert in the energy transition and clearly wasn't. And I'm wondering, I want to ask you the same question that I asked Scott. What's your take on geoscientists who claim to have broader expertise than their qualifications and their experience would warrant?
Well, I think I'd answer that through a geophysicist, for myself as one who would like to claim expertise in the climate crisis. I would say it's rooted in the understanding of multivariable analysis. I've heard a lot of geoscientists that claim that they are experts and they talk only about CO2 and historical levels of CO2 and historical temperatures on the earth. Well, that's not a multivariable analysis. I would like to see somebody talking about the 9 boundaries of the planet and the fact that climate is only one of those 9 boundaries, and the other 8 include, plastics in our oceans and ocean acidification and, land degradation. So again, when Scott talks about, we need to be talking about the right arena. We shouldn't be talking about 2050 emissions reductions. We need to be talking about ecological stability. So back to your comment about water function, that comes from repairing the land and repairing the water systems. That's the arena that we need to be working in. And we're not, as we're saying, we're talking about building technology. Then none of that came with building technology. That comes with, I'll give you a very live example. In 2015, when I was at Imaginea, which was a company that was an oil and gas company that was imagining a new way of doing business, we put solar panels to power a site. Now, to Scott's point, I completely agree. We need to look at what's the longevity of that site and how much energy is it using to both have these, solar on site and potentially producing excess gas. Like, we need to look at all of those variables to decide. But what we did as a company was we put it on a site that only had less than 5 years of longevity for that well, because an engineer did not make that decision. It was made from a technical staff person who just decided it was a good site because it was close to the road. So these are the decisions and the arenas that are not happening. We literally need to look at the $260 billion. I'll stop after this, Markham. We need to look at those sites and we need to prioritize them at scale. And we need to be deciding what is staying. And that will be what is transitioned to renewables. And the rest of it needs to start getting peeled away from the landscape.
Jenny, don't go away. I actually want to address this question because it's your question, and it's about universal climate risk mitigation guidelines for financial institutions. And I confess this is not an area that I've done a lot of work in as a journalist. But you've made the point that risk mitigation guidelines for both financial institutions, but also for corporations that were working in Alberta, are, I think, inadequate. Is my takeaway from your question? But maybe you could address that.
Yeah, I think the key thing to mention there is, like, there's financial risk to this. So let's say, you don't look at the environmental part of this. There's a financial risk to all of these decisions too, right? We have a steel shortage. There's been supply chain issues. I learned this at the doors from a kid that worked at the Flames Arena, that the reason why the arena didn't go forward at that time is because Trans Mountain was using those same materials. There was an actual supply constraint. So these are financial risks, and a really good example of the financial concerns, I think, were demonstrated by the Pathways Alliance companies removing this technology off of their websites. That is a corporate risk to be supporting projects like that. So to me, the point is, it's both a physical risk which we've talked about, the safety, but it's also a financial risk to our companies and that stranded capital that Zac was mentioning. At some point, these assets, we cannot assume they're going to be around for 50 years.
Zac, I want to address the same question to you. How do you, as an engineer, within the APEGA Code of Conduct, address the issue of risk when very often you're sort of downstream from the people who are making the decisions about the scoping of the project?
So in my scope, we deal with risk all the time. Most engineers see that, and we're involved in root cause analysis and figuring out what went wrong. And we do make economic decisions. Should we buy the expensive, gold-plated valve, or should we get the cheap, last for 5 years valve? And we do these trade-offs at that detailed level all the time. The processes are there. And I think what the other panelists, mention is that we haven't expanded that and move it upstream. And when we're making these decisions, we involve all the different people. There'll be electrical, there'll be process, there'll be chemical engineers to bounce those ideas around. And that's just not happening further up. To say, someone says, I think this is true, let's beat it up. Let's look at it this way, left, center, right, all these different ideas.
Of. I want to talk about risk risk to assets, and the context for me here is carbon capture storage for the oil sands, because I've asked the minister's office, and I mean Wilkinson, Canadian Natural Resources Minister, said, has the minister or the department reviewed modeling to ensure that oil sands producers are competitive, that they'll be around in a declining demand scenario? So imagine peak oil in 2030, short plateau, and then you've got a decline curve starting, and you've just spent, the the Canadian taxpayer spent tens of billions of dollars subsidizing all of this building of this material, of this project, and then the companies aren't around. And who's on the hook for that money? Who's on the hook to clean it up? Well, what happens at Site C? If there are problems with the foundation, for example, who pays for that? So maybe you could address the issue of risk from that point of view.
I think that is a terrific point, Markham. We have a bunch of examples in Canada. We have the Muskrat Falls Dam that was engineered, designed against vast technical opposition that ended up having to get bailed out by about $5 billion by the federal government. We have the Kiosk Dam that had a similar poorly executed economic idea. And I know some of the people who presented in Ottawa on some of these projects were not technical people, and yet they were held up at committees. Site C Dam was the same thing. The Trans Mountain Pipeline was also the same thing. What happens in Canada is that we have these organizations and we have these panels to review these, but they're either bypassed, like the Utilities Commission was bypassed in the Site C, so it couldn't be properly beaten up, as Zac said. I think that's a good way to say. Things get better when they're criticized. And what we're doing now is we're not criticizing them and they're not being held to account. And then I think the biggest problem that we have in Canada is that when these projects happen and they go through and they're a massive failure, politicians like to polish the turd. They basically go and they say, this is a great project. Look at what we did. We spent all this money, and they aren't honest about it. And again, I bring back Richard Feynman is like a hero of mine. And he's a guy that would go out in these projects in the United States and say, guys, I mean, pardon my French on this, but it looks like shit. It smells like shit. It tastes like shit. It's shit. And you cannot, we keep on doing this and doing it over and over. And I think carbon capture is the same thing on that, is that you have to have someone poke holes into it, no pun intended, because it's going to go and leak. And then you're just wasting money.
And let's bring you had a question about LNG electrification in BC. You brought it up earlier in the conversation, and a hobby horse of mine is that in Canada, the public conversation around energy is really bad. I mean, it's basically a provincial government fighting with the federal government over a policy, or it's promotion of narratives and so on. But rarely do we get into the meat of issues. And LNG electrification seems to be one of those, because there have been, huge issues raised about, will there be enough electricity? And what happens if Shell does phase 2 of LNG Canada? And then where's that electricity going to come from? And what does that mean for rates? And all of those issues are discussed. They don't seem to be discussed in any forum that the public has access to. And I'm not even sure that engineers are involved in that. I don't know. But what's your take on it?
Yeah, so I mean, again, the framing on this, and all the electrical engineers will understand this, but the public doesn't. The energy is not the problem. It's the capacity of the wires. And we have a huge shortage of capacity of wires in certain locations. And I mean, the large transmission line to Fort McMurray is an example of where we have the other thing, where you have a large capacity and not used. But building that infrastructure is very expensive. And what we're seeing in British Columbia is, because we've had this dream of all these 20 LNG projects that are never going to happen, economically they would never happen, and we're trying to quote unquote greenwash it by saying we're going to electrify them and use the electricity for them. What it does is it stops all the other industries, electrical industries, sustainable industries, and the mining from moving forward, because BC Hydro says we don't have the capacity for you because this project's going to happen. Or, I mean, another one is this hydrogen project is going to happen. We know economically these projects aren't going to happen, but you can't kick them out of the queue. So the better way for, specifically when we're talking about LNG, is to say, okay, first of all, if you're going to do the plant, you have to self-power. You have to use your own gas, the natural gas that's coming in, to run your compressors and then export that LNG. It's not economically feasible to electricity, and it doesn't reduce emissions. All it means is that that gas that was going to be burnt here for the compressors is now going to be burnt in China. So you're basically converting clean and green electricity in BC into natural gas that is burned in China and disadvantaging the locals from using that electricity.
I'm going to take some questions from our audience, and we have one from James Sterling, who asks that notes that the Alberta government has made promises to reform professional regulation, and in the opinion of the two Alberta professionals, Jenny and Zac, well, maybe we'll start with Zac. Any ideas on reforms that would make APEGA more effective?
Yeah, I think the UCP is going the opposite direction, trying to loosen those regulations, which I think is dangerous. The reason that you have these professional bodies in medicine, in law, and in engineering is it takes a long time to build up that knowledge and build up that experience, and you want to be able to trust it. When I go to the doctor and they tell me something, I want to trust their words. I don't have the time to research that. So I think we should be strengthening that, and having the engineering associations across Canada pick up the torch and get involved in that, and saying, we're in a changing world in many different directions. How are we going to educate our people? Scott mentioned it's self-directed. How do we direct it a bit more? How do we make sure to say Alberta engineers are experts in X, and we have the ability to prove it? We know we're experts in oil and gas. What's our expertise going to be in the next decade?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did an APEGA presentation in early November on the global energy transition, and set out the hypothesis that technical change is already taking place in key things like electric vehicles, wind and solar. That then disrupts an industry, that then disrupts other industries. There are knock-on effects. All of those kinds of things have to be taken into account, and very often aren't, especially in public conversations. So, Jenny, what's your take on what might be required to improve APEGA?
Yeah, I completely agree with Zac. My concerns around what the provincial government is up to is potentially to not make Alberta's regulations the same as other provinces, which the only time I actually used my APEGA signature was on a BC document, because my authority is not just within the province. It gives me the authority across Canada because of those regulations being consistent with not only Canadian standards, but world standards. So to me, it is, I love that you called this a dilemma conversation, because we're deciding to participate in a future where we honor data and we look to data to help drive decisions, or we're deciding not to measure. And to me, that is not participating in the transition. And we don't, in my view, have the luxury of doing that. And the thing you spoke about early on in this conversation, Markham, is the fact that there's the prediction that oil is peaking very soon. The IEA put out their belief that next year we're going to see a 1 million barrel a day surplus in 2025. Zac said this early on too. What is the safety risk of these sites running if there's nowhere to store this product? We need to start as professionals looking at how would we safely shut this down if we needed to. That is a realistic question that we should be asking ourselves today, even if the answer is 2030. That is, to me, the work that we should be working on as professionals. And that, to me, is what I want to be a part of as a professional engineer or geophysicist, excuse me.
Can you just very quickly, Jenny, address the issue of, if you need to stop something, do you have all the authority you need under a PEGA now to stop it? I mean, the point was made, Scott made it, you made it, that engineers can stop anything that they think is unsafe. But are you able to stop something if there are these other issues, transition issues, water issues, and so on, that are in play?
This is, to me, the question is, this is the physical, can we shut the stuff in? Like, we use fresh water to kill wells, for example. What if there's a drought and we don't have that water? These are the real safety concerns that we need to be talking about as professionals, to actually physically be able to shut down these assets in a safe way under stressful circumstances. You know, a really good example is the fires. There were, from what I understand, last year, tanks that were surrounded, engulfed in flames, that they didn't even have the time to shut down the assets before the fire came through. You know, these are real life issues that we need to be taking a step back and looking at, how do we plan for these things and how do we prevent?
Got a question from Karen Crosby that's near and dear to my heart. And she asks, what can the public do to influence our government to stop bailing out projects that are not economically viable? I'll take a crack at that later on. But Scott, because of your interest in LNG projects in BC and Site C, what would you say to Karen?
It's a really good question. And I used to believe that you would go through the Utility Commission. And I have lost faith in the ability of the Utility Commission. I mean, you try your best. You sign up as an intervener and you try your best and you promote it. You talk to CBC. You talk to, I mean, maybe the best thing is you talk to someone like Markham Hislop, who actually understands it and can actually get it out. But what I'm noticing is the big media outlets, when you talk to them, they throw up their hands and say, this is beyond our level of understanding. We can't push forward with this, and we're understaffed. The Site C thing, going back to that, and the instability of the geological instability there. Right now, I'd say something that we could push for is say the government has to give an emergency response plan if that dam collapses, because there's a real chance that that will happen in the next 60 years. And we don't have an emergency response plan. And the town of Peace River, Alberta, will cease to exist if there is a catastrophic collapse of that dam. And there is no plan for it. So those are the things. I think it's just raising awareness and getting it out there. But will politicians and will media listen? I don't know.
Well, as somebody who's been in the media for a long time and has grappled with this particular issue, it's the issues we're talking about are highly, highly technical, and mainstream media organizations like the CBC or CTV, whoever it might be, simply don't have the resources to dedicate, like we used to do investigative reporting, to get up to speed on the technical requirements. I mean, I do it because I'm in a position to do it, and that's all well and good. But I'm one person. Energy Media is one company, and it's very, very difficult. And particularly, I'm right in the midst of reviewing probably maybe a dozen major energy transition modeling reports out to 2050. So the OPEC's World Oil Outlook report, the IEA reports, Rystad, ExxonMobil, and so on. It's an eye-opener because Alberta is just not aware of how rapidly change and disruption are happening in the global energy system. And so if the government doesn't understand, and the industry, I would argue, doesn't understand, and the engineering profession and geoscientist profession don't understand, how do you have that conversation? Where does the media come into this if we're not even having the right conversation about the right issue? We're talking about things that we should have talked about 10 years ago, not today. So Zac, maybe just give us your take on Karen's question.
Yeah, if you asked me this question 10 years ago, I would have said vote. But like Scott said, I mean, some of the stuff is just being bypassed through the right channels anyway. My answer is organize. through a community organization, through a labor union, through an organization, and build that up and talk to folks, figure out, learn what you don't know, fill in the gaps, and do what you can locally to affect change. I remember when I started my career 20 years ago, people said we need LNG to pay for the energy transition in the future. Well, we're here and it never happened, right? So empty promises you can find everywhere, but where are the people actually doing the work? Find those people and support them.
Jenny, I have a question from Sid Kubuka, and I hope, Sid, that I pronounced your name correctly. But Jenny, Sid asks if every engineer knows from experience the carbon capture and storage leaks that the wells that are used to sequester that CO2 in the I guess in the reservoir, the old reservoirs, or wherever it is that they're storing it. Isn't it a breach of professional practice not to stop it, or at least to raise that issue and make it a public issue, make it an issue with the regulators, but make it an issue somewhere?
Yeah, to me, I think we should have the right as geoscientists and engineers to refuse this work. I think how we got here, just to be clear, is carbon capture utilization and utilization works. So just to be clear, the whole reason how we got here is using it as a tertiary mechanism to free oil from reservoirs as they get older. CO2 or other gases can help remove that adherence to the rock and helps that come out. So that's how we got here. We've been using it for the purposes of utilization, which is you do get more oil production from injecting gas. That part is real. But the cycling part is something that has also come along with it that we know of. And that's the part where I'm saying the storage part is not there. And just a reminder from this conversation again is that's happening because those decisions of those projects are happening outside of the control of geoscientists and engineers. We're basically being told we're partaking in this, or we're not even. We hear about it happening in another department and are curious about it, but we don't actually aren't privy to that activity happening. So to me, it's this decompartmentalization need that is required across the industry that's going to help us start coming together and saying what arenas should we be participating in. And that's one of them. Dams is another really good one. That we're removing dams across the world, and we're just about to kickstart the Site C dam. This is not what a professional ecologist would recommend, to use a dam for, storing water and power. It's not the right answer, and yet that's what we're still investing in. These are all the areas where we're still moving in the wrong direction.
I interviewed economist Professor Kent Fellows from the University of Calgary 3 or 4 years ago, and he looked at the question of the Site C dam. If you were going to sell the electricity from that dam to residential and business customers, is it economic? No, they should have shut it down right at the beginning. They shouldn't. If you use that electricity use the hydro dams as a big battery, so that allows you then to build in Alberta and in British Columbia huge amounts of wind and solar, and so that the hydro dam and the intermittent renewables can work together. That's a higher value for the hydroelectric dam, and then it is economic. And I did that interview. Nobody else did that interview. The conversation went nowhere. And so there's an example of not an engineer or a geoscientist, but an economist who had done the math and had come out, and that should have been considered, I think, should have been considered by the government when they made the decision to go ahead with it. And it doesn't appear that's been the case. So these kinds of risk analyses, these kinds of economic analyses, I don't know whether they're done, but they often seem to be ignored. Well, we've come to the end of the hour. This has been a terrific conversation. I want to thank our guests, our panelists, Jenny Yeremiy, who's a geoscientist, and Zac Trolley, who's an Alberta engineer, and Scott Janzen, who is a BC-based engineer, electrical engineer. And thank you for all of you, for everyone who's come out. We're going to put this up on our Energi Media YouTube channel, so you'll be able to find it there if you want to share it amongst your professional network or wherever you want to share it. And also, I would encourage you to check us out. You can find us on our Energy Media on Facebook, on Twitter, on Blue Sky, and LinkedIn, and probably a couple of others that I've forgotten. But engage with us on social media. Maybe consider becoming a member of the Energy Circle and part of that work and the conversations we have. But thank you very much for attending today.